welcome to the lecture series that we've been doing since the semester started. My name is Sabaina Ama Osam Sasa, and I'm the secretary for this center, that is the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. Now, we are doing a lecture today. Now, it says that migration has shaped societies for centuries, yet today it presents complex challenges that test social cohesion and policy framework. As we explore these issues, let us engage with open minds and a shared commitment to fostering inclusion and understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of us today. Professor Fleming will say something brief, then we introduce the speaker, then the program comments. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. How are you all? Thank you very much for joining us today for our second installment of the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series at the African University of Communications and Business. My name is Dr. Mankutam, Professor Mankutam. Many of you know me as Tracy Keith Fleming. I want to reiterate again the significance of the mission of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies is committed to becoming a leading center for Pan-African scholarship and collaboration, bringing together scholars and thinkers from the African world to conduct research and deliberate on issues affecting the welfare and destiny of African peoples and to disseminate their findings as widely as possible. Additionally, the Nketia Center will be an incubator for innovative research to generate new knowledge that advances professional practice for those at the cutting edge of transformative development. The center contributes significantly to the university's mission of preparing lifelong learners to become innovative problem solvers and ethical leaders in the fields of communication, business, and related areas through excellence in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and collaboration at the local, regional, and global levels using a Pan-African framework, as well as to the university's core value of embracing African cultural values. And this aligns with the AUCB strategic plan for 2022 through 2027. Some of you have paid close attention to our pillars that are in the vestibule of the Discovery House. The university is not merely a university in Africa with an African label. It is an African university with an ethos and the explicit intent to produce graduates who fully understand and appreciate and unapologetically manifest their Africanness in all spheres of their lives. The need to provide an education at the tertiary level that enhances the self-awareness of students as Black people, as Africans, led to the establishment in 2009 of the Center for Africana Studies at this university. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies was officially launched on the 22nd of June of 2015 as an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the creation and advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the Black diaspora through scholarly research, teaching, and publication aimed at the regeneration of Black people and societies. We welcome you to the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series at the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to introduce the speaker for the day. I am Eweh Johnson. Mr. Promise Eweh is a Ph.D. candidate in African Studies at the University of Ghana. He is interested in examining the theories and practices that are shaping Africa's development and their impact on common people, with particular attention to agriculture, employment, and the informal economy. He looks forward to a future of engagement and collaborative research with local communities and persons of diverse backgrounds, interested in the living conditions of Africa's working people. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Promise Eweh.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. So my presentation is titled The Migration Crisis, Social Relations, the Migration Crisis and Social Relations in Migrant Destinations. In the fairly recent discussion of the migration issue, the word crisis is put in quotation marks, I guess to suggest that there's nothing necessarily new about migration in the contemporary period, or that the economic rationale for migration is overemphasized. Contrary to this view, I consider the term crisis appropriate not only because of the spate, or more accurately the desire to migrate, but also because of our current economic, social, and political juncture. The late Professor Sami Amin, in one of his discussions about the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, note that the enslavement of the African population for the production of sugar and cotton in North America and the Caribbean contributed to depopulation of Africa and partly explains the continent's underdevelopment. In contrast, Africa's population was largely seen by most experts and international development agencies as a primary cause of the continent's underdevelopment, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. And this prompted support for the use of family planning programs to reduce family sizes. In recent decades, however, this negative view of Africa's high population growth has given rise to an optimist view of the continent's population, which is found in the concept of the demographic dividends. And this refers to the accelerated economic growth that countries can harness as a result of the change in age structure following demographic transition. Due to reduced child dependency burden and cost of child services, savings increase and resources are freed for greater per capita spending on quality health and education services, for capital formation to spur further economic development. But before I continue, I think it's important that I highlight some key or important facts. The first is that the population of sub-Saharan Africa currently stands at 1.2 billion, and this is expected to increase to 2 billion by 2050. Also, by 2050, 20% or 1 out of 5 of the world's labor force will come from Africa. Lastly, children aged 15 years and lower comprise 41% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has more youth than any of the other world's regions. A young population, however, places a heavy responsibility on households, communities, and governments. For example, the first 5 years of a child's life are extremely important because it is the period within which the lives of many children are lost. And it is therefore important to improve the chances of survival through practices such as child nutrition, but also improving maternal health and ensuring that adequate and quality health infrastructure are in place to attend to emergency and critical health issues that cannot be managed by households. The next challenge that African governments have to deal with with respect to the large young population is the issue of education. Here, I think that it is important to focus on the comprehensive approach to education, so that education policy and funding is not focused on just one layer or a sector of the education system. And I would even suggest or argue that more attention is given to basic education, technical and vocational education and training, and traditional apprenticeship outside of the formal system, since these appear to be underfunded. Attention should also be given to infrastructure, not only in the limited physical sense, but to school and health nutrition programs, the improved quality of school water and sanitation services, especially for girls in rural and poor urban areas. And there are also issues of gender inequalities in education. For example, in a recent survey in Uganda, it was found that compared to boys, girls are less likely to continue education up to the secondary school level. But this is not just a Uganda issue, as such issues pertain to much of the continent. Slide please. In general, at the primary and secondary levels, almost 3 in 10 school-age children are out of school. And for those who make it to primary school, the completion rate is around 65%, against a world average of 87%. And the literacy rate for persons aged 15 to 24 years is only 75%, compared to almost 90%. Also, most African citizens are dissatisfied with government performance in the education sector. Slide, please. For example, a recent survey showed that 48% of Africans rated their government as performing fairly well in addressing their educational needs, while the remaining 52% rated government performance as fairly badly. But there are wide variations in perceptions of government performance, so that in Zambia and Tanzania, 82% of respondents rated the government as doing fairly well, whereas in Ghana and Congo-Brazzaville, 61 and 73% of respondents rated the government as performing fairly badly. How to finance the many programs and projects required for developing the human capacity of many young people is now a major challenge that African governments have to deal with. Because by February 2022, 7 African governments were already in debt distress, while an additional 16 countries were at higher rates of debt distress. But for me, the most important challenge that the large young population places on African government is that of employment. And the unemployment problem has been a major problem since the post-colonial period, and it does not show any signs of abating soon. Popular commentaries often attribute the unemployment problem to factors which in fact have very little significance in explaining the phenomenon. For example, one government policy document attributes the employment problem to weak linkage between the educational system and productive sectors of the economy, or the mismatch of skills acquired by the youth vis-a-vis what is required in the job market. But the fact is that most of African economies are driven by the production of extractive resources such as minerals and oil production. Aside cash crop production, Ghana's economy, as well as that of other African countries, is driven by the extraction of mineral resources. These are largely privatized resources that generate only a small number of jobs, and those jobs are mostly dominated by men. At the same time, Ghana's manufacturing sector has from the 1980s declined, and this experience is not peculiar to only Ghana but to the rest of Africa and the third world. So manufacturing has basically collapsed. Agriculture is the single largest employer of our economy, but poverty is highest in that occupational group than in any other sector of the economy. In recent decades, the financial sector also featured as an important player in Ghana's economy. And this also explains why some people feel so strongly about the collapse of some local banks. And some of these people feel that the government should have supported or protected such banks from collapse and to ensure that there's local participation in Ghana's banking industry. Thus, although there has been some remarkable growth in our economies, these have not produced sufficient jobs for many young people. Therefore, many young people cannot find jobs because of these factors. I remember how one young man commented, in the context of the government measures to tax the gains from sports betting, how the government lacked awareness of the importance that sports betting had for the youth. It was as if sports betting was helping some young people to cope with the employment crisis. And I'm not saying that to indicate that I support or condone sports betting, but I think it is a reality that we have to always keep in mind. In this next session, I'll move on to the core migration issue. So the session is titled Africans on the Move. So to continue from the previous section, my argument is that unemployment and poverty are driving migration both within and across the continent's borders. A survey conducted by Afrobarometer last year found that almost half of Africans have considered migrating, including 27% who have given emigration a lot of thought. Migration is of course not new in Africa, and it is encouraged in some cases. For example, among some ethnic communities in Ghana, migrating for work is seen as a rite of passage. But this positive view of migration also finds expression in government policy. Migration is viewed in a positive light because of the remittances that migrants send home. And in fact, last year in Gambia, remittances from Gambians living and working abroad totaled $776 million, accounting for almost 32% of GDP, which was at par with the same value accrued from the tourism sector. And in Ghana, government policy on migration highlights the integration of migrants into the economies of host countries, as well as the protection of their human rights. Because migration is for the most part underpinned by economic factors, Africans have moved to places with better economic opportunities whenever their home countries were in bad economic shape. And migration scholars continue to emphasize that majority of the migration in Africa occurs on the continent. However, Africans have also moved beyond the continent's borders. And in the latter case, the destinations that usually come to mind are Western Europe and North America. However, Margaret Peel, who has written on the subject of migration in Ghana, notes that Ghanaians were living in Ukraine even in the 1990s. Among migrants, there are those who have access to capital and are able to acquire the documentation required for formal travel, residence, and participation in economic activities in destination countries. But there are also many who do not have much of a choice than to migrate through irregular or informal migration routes. This latter group of people include African youth who are taking dangerous risks in order to escape joblessness or hopelessness. The International Organization for Migration has over the years been tracking cases of deaths and disappearances that occur in the course of such irregular migration through a project that it refers to as the Missing Migrants Project. And a new report released by the project notes that 63,285 people died or disappeared in the migration process between 2014 and 2023. However, the difficulty with collecting data on deaths and disappearances indicates that this number is understated, noted the report. Please slide. Majority of the deaths occur in the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean as people try to cross the sea to Europe, mainly to Italy, Spain, and France, or the Canary Islands. Deaths also occur between the Horn of Africa and Yemen, and en route from the Caribbean to the United States. Deaths are mainly due to drowning, but violence is increasingly becoming an important cause of death, especially in the Sahara Desert. Another thing that the report notes is that most of those who died could not be identified. That is, it is difficult to track which countries they were coming from. On the list of the countries of origin of dead or missing persons are two African countries, namely Senegal and Ethiopia. However, 25,000 out of the more than 63,000 people who have died or disappeared come from Africa. And the missing migrants data also shows that conflicts and sanctions are major drivers of irregular migration. The report also shows that deaths or disappearances of persons rose sharply in 2023. For example, in 2023, 8,542 people died or went missing during migration. This was an increase of 20% over the figure that was recorded in 2022. And the Missing Migration Project recognized 2023 as the deadliest year on record. I think that this high increase in deaths is another reason why I think the use of the phrase migration crisis is appropriate. But migrants are not warmly welcomed in the places that they go, whether they get there through regular means or irregular means. Migrants are disliked and they are the targets of discrimination and violent abuse. Results of survey conducted in the industrial world indicate that many national citizens would not assist immigrants, and some support the deportation of immigrants, even if they got there legally. They even support deportation if migrants are unemployed. Immigrants are seen as a threat to economic well-being and cultural identity. And some national citizens are opposed to diversity, indicating that they would prefer a monocultural society where a majority of the population shared the same culture. And here I'm quoting from Ramankandran. Lastly, some national citizens avoid all social interaction with immigrants and ethnic minorities residing in their countries. And in the industrial world, African migrants seem to be more likely to be discriminated against or targeted for violent abuse than any other ethnic group. But neither are migrants treated fairly in the third world, and it appears that in some cases they are treated even worse. Therefore, similar to the industrial world, nationals in the global south or the third world support the deportation of immigrants, even if they got to the host country through legal means. Further, citizens in global south or third world countries are willing to participate in collective action that prevents migrants from living, operating businesses, or from gaining access to employment. African migrants or refugees in the global south have on some occasions been lynched and described the ways in which they were treated as some form of slavery. Because of my interest in economic realities and economic development in Africa and the rest of the third world, my initial explanation for the violence against migrants is that these attacks are born out of the inability of national government in migrant receiving areas to promote equitable development, social services, and access to social justice and access to social services that give hope to a better future, even if current times are difficult. Or another explanation I would give is that migrant workers are paid lower salaries and are thus used to displace local labor. However, the peculiar forms that violence against small migrant populations take make explanations based solely on economic logic inadequate. And I agree with those who have described the economic rationales for the violence against migrants as an oversimplification. Therefore, other concepts that have been suggested for understanding the dislike and violence towards migrants include nationalism, indigeneity, nativism, and citizenship. For example, Nzlovu Gashen notes that academic discussions of belonging and citizenship have been influenced by a set of questions including who belongs to the nation, how is citizenship defined and granted, why have identities become so politically explosive, why has nationalism degenerated into nativism and xenophobia. Interestingly, the term xenophobia is used alongside terms such as racism and nationalism. In this next session, I want to talk about the discrimination against Africans after the start of the war in Ukraine, 2022. In the industrial world, the dislike and intolerance of immigrants also has racial undertones, and is another reason why economic explanations are inadequate for understanding the discrimination and violence against African migrants. Discrimination based on race, colorism, and gender also points to the importance of power relations. A case in point were the many issues reiterated by many African workers and students following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This included, for example, the reservation of one gate where Ukrainian citizens were allowed to freely cross to Poland, while there was a tight control of another gate which was reserved for Africans and other non-Ukrainian nationals. And while the new route for boarding of trains emphasized that women and children would be allowed to board trains before men, African women were separated from white men and were sometimes prevented from boarding the trains. Reacting to the prioritization of white women over other women, one African woman noted, "But I'm a woman as well." And the awareness of discrimination at train stations and border crossings on the basis of race, gender, and colorism may have influenced some in planning their journeys, or more accurately, their escape. Here, I would like to quote from Kinson and Ikakiti below. Please slide. Next. Yes. Concerns about racial discrimination were sometimes factored into decision making. Praise, who describes herself as not light, not chocolate, and dark, made travel decisions on the assumption she would face racial discrimination at border crossings. One of her friends reported that some black African and Muslim students had to fight to gain entry to trains, and she believed that a dark-skinned black woman would have fewer options in transit. She was prepared to spend a lot of money if necessary. She reflected, "If I have to spend $2,000 to save my life, that's what I have to do." The media reports also show that African and other migrants were sometimes prevented from crossing the border to other countries, or that neighboring countries were hesitant to receive African migrants. The report further indicates that African students were beaten or shoved at train terminals, or that soldiers would sometimes shoot into the air to intimidate them. These African students were pursuing university degree programs in the health sciences, especially in the fields of medicine, pharmacy, and dentistry, but also engineering and other STEM disciplines. And they included Africans not only from West, East, and Southern Africa, but from Morocco and Egypt, where you'd expect more adequate and well-resourced academic departments and programs for STEM education. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Libya Muammar Gaddafi's Pan-Africanism, and the powers that be. So I would like to give some attention to Libya. The Libya case is important because Libya is in recent times seen as a transit point for persons who wish to illegally enter Europe. Obviously, Libya cannot be discussed without talking about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Colonel Gaddafi came to power in Libya in 1969 after the overthrow of King Idris. And his coming to power coincided with a period of high prices of petroleum products. And as a major oil producing country, Libya generated a lot of revenue through the sale of petroleum products. This revenue fueled the development of major infrastructure projects, and Libya became a destination for many migrants. Migration to Libya was further propelled by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's encouragement of the movement of workers from sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the 1990s. At some point, it was estimated that 1.5 to 2 million migrants resided in Libya. Some estimates even suggest that at some point 30% of the population in Libya was constituted of migrants. The 1990s is identified as a point in Gaddafi's life in which he sought stronger ties with sub-Saharan Africa and not just with Northern Africa or the Middle East. And another window for viewing Gaddafi's Pan-Africanism was his support for Ghana's PNDC government in its early days. When the PNDC government was hard-pressed for financial assistance, here I'm quoting the words of Yvonne Chikata, Libya played a crucial role by providing 28,000 metric tons of crude oil in July 1982. Over the next 6 months, 12 such consignments were provided, each on free credit for a year and interest-free payment after that. Gaddafi also supported the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and played an important role in the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. But I also think it is important not to paint too much of a perfect or rosy picture of Libya and Gaddafi. Indeed, there are documented cases of deportation, violence and racist abuse of migrant workers and small migrant communities in the 1990s and 2000s. These attacks were mainly directed at persons from Sudan, Chad, Ghana and Nigeria, among others. The attacks occurred in the context of previous deportations of African migrant workers, the normalization of relations with Europe after sanctions, which had a serious and negative impact on Libya's economy, have been removed, concerns about entry of fundamentalist Islamic groups, and the Libya parliament's plan to tighten immigration by apprehending and deporting migrants without papers. However, although African migrants faced racist abuse, Libya was at the same time a destination that provided employment for youth who could not, as a result of their class, meet the requirements, the financial and other requirements for regular migration to Europe. And the study by Bob Miller and Bob Miller shows that more than half of the Ghanaian migrants in Libya came from Brong-Ahafo region, which sort of sits in the middle with respect to Ghana's economic landscape. Brong-Ahafo region is not the poorest, and neither is it the wealthiest, and it is constituted of people of diverse ethnicities. These workers spent months traveling by land to Libya, some spending close to 3 months or even 6 months traveling to Libya. However, the military intervention in Libya in 2011 has completely destroyed Libya's role as an economic powerhouse, an important destination for migrants on the African continent. No serious person now thinks of Libya as a destination for migrants since the invasion of Libya by the major powers in 2011. Prior to the invasion, there were discussions on the form that the intervention in Libya would take, or even whether direct military intervention was necessary after all. These discussions were held not only among the European countries, but also the important players in the US administration. Amid this indecision, French President Nicolas Sarkozy took the lead, and the war against Gaddafi in Libya started on March 19, 2011. The African Union had been calling for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. It had its own roadmap for addressing the many issues and the hostilities that had been raised. Some of the issues that it also sought to address included protection of foreign nationals and African migrant workers in Libya. But these were all ignored by the world's major powers, and bombing missions continued for several months before coming to an end on October 31st. Some of the European countries, for example Italy, which had prior to the intervention been complaining about Libya's role as a transit point for migrants seeking to cross the Mediterranean to Europe, participated in the intervention in different ways. The intervention had a direct impact on migrant workers, and Professor Horace Campbell, who has written on the military intervention in Libya, notes that the bombing campaigns did not only target Libya's military infrastructure, but also migrant workers. The experience in Libya again brings into view the recurring linkages between migration, class, race, and gender. And I would like to quote Professor Campbell essentially, so if you could please permit me. He notes, there had been over 600,000 foreign workers employed in the Libyan economy. By far the largest number of migrant workers were Africans from neighboring countries. When the NATO bombing campaigns began, most states evacuated their citizens, but the poorer states in Africa did not have the resources to evacuate their own. Many of these migrant workers were caught in the crossfire and lost their lives and livelihoods. He continues, the AU's diplomatic efforts brought out a number of realities. The most significant was that other states, when evacuating their nationals, were leaving Africans behind. More than 900 Africans drowned in the Mediterranean Sea trying to escape the fighting in Libya. Still continuing, in one spectacular incident, 2 survivors reported the tragic story of a boat carrying 72 African immigrants that ran into difficulty trying to reach the Italian port of Lampedusa. The Africans on board, including women and children, were left to drift in the Mediterranean Sea for 16 days after a number of European military units apparently ignored their cries for help. 2 of the 9 survivors claimed this included a NATO ship. Despite alarms being raised with the Italian Coast Guard and the boat making contact with a military helicopter and a warship, no rescue effort was attempted. In fact, facing the prospect of hundreds of African migrants leaving Libya, France and Italy sought to work with other members of the EU to block their departures. As Africans drowned by the hundreds, these NATO states showed both their disregard for the international maritime law regarding safety of life at sea and their lack of respect for African lives. That was a very long quote forward, so thanks for letting me do that. I think the Libya case is a call on us to revisit and discuss some important issues. First, it points to other channels or patterns of trade, slavery, and migration aside from the Atlantic. And in light of this, I think it is important, or it would be useful for us to again have discussions of the transatlantic and trans-Saharan trade, and to refresh our minds on their different forms and impacts on the African population. Because sometimes I get the impression, or it is suggested, that the trans-Saharan trade had a far more devastating effect on the African population. Secondly, given that much of the violence against migrants in Libya was directed at people from Mali and Chad, both Muslim majority countries, I think it would be interesting to examine the extent to which the brotherhood or sisterhood provided by religion helps migrants in navigating the social and economic life in host countries. I also think that migration research should be given more attention. And I think that it is important to conduct primary and original field work, as research focusing on migrants could contribute to the wider literature on the linkages between gender, race, and class. So as conclusion, with discussions on the implications of H-1B visas, the derogatory remarks by political leaders against small migrant communities, plans to revoke birthright citizenship, the raise and hunting of immigrants, the rallying of political constituencies around the building of borders, and in fact the actual installation of razor wire border fences. One African country planning to serve as the base for receiving migrants that a former colonizer wishes to reject. The migration issue is now more alive than ever on the political and academic agenda. I would like to thank Professor Mankuta, Tracy Fleming, and the AUCC for the invitation to participate in this event. Thank you very much.
So we're very grateful to have my colleague, friend, and brother, Promise Eweh, joining us today. And it's really inspiring, I think, to our students to have a soon-to-be newly minted Ph.D. from the University of Ghana in African Studies. That will be on the 11th Tuesday. We are very honored to have you here, sir. I think our students have gained quite a bit from you. So I wanted to remind them of the privilege that we have of you visiting us today. And this is not Mr. Eweh's first time visiting us. He also was one of our participants in our most recent iteration of the Pan-African Heritage World Festival that took place at the Business Development Center under the auspices of the Pan-African Heritage Museum that our founder, Honorable Kojo Yanka, is spearheading, and which will also house our main campus of this university in the future, close to Winneba. But I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Anyone want to ask a question? I have many questions I've written down, but I'm going to save my questions. Hopefully I will save them until students have had an opportunity to engage you.
I think not only questions, if they have any stories they want to share relating to the topic as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So both are allowed.
Absolutely. So who wants, yes, madam. Do you need a microphone or you'll project for us? Thank you.
I've had this question for quite a long time about this migration racism kind of thing. You know, see, considering how when we migrate from here, we get treated over there. I think they also feel that when they come here, we're going to treat them the same way. So when they come, they don't really get, they feel that way. So they don't really get the time to like know us better. Like this, that's for me. That's what I feel. Because when we go there, we don't get treated. We don't even have the chance to like associate ourselves with them. We are treated differently because of our color, where we're coming from. So when they come here, they want to feel superior about because we don't give them the chance. It's like they are not able to connect. They feel we are going to treat them the way they treated us because of our color. I don't know if that's it's though, but that's how I feel.
Okay. And when you say they, who are you referring to?
Light skins.
Light-skinned people. White. Hmm.
Okay. Do you want to answer that
Maybe,
question or take a few more?
Maybe another one.
Okay. So we'll take another question and then he will answer them in whichever order he chooses. Next question. Anybody with a related question? That was a very good start. Anyone?
If not, I will just answer and then we'll take another.
Okay, we'll answer that one, and then I may throw some of my questions in the mix as well. So please.
Okay. So I'm not so sure about the relations between African migrants and light-skinned people. I guess where from anecdotal evidence where I sense there's some tension is between African migrants and other Africans or Black Americans living in the north. That's where I understand there is some tension. But I think I think there's a lot of misconception out there, and that if we really get to know each other, maybe we get to live and share same facilities, some of these things may be dispelled. So I think some of the programs that some of the universities are having that allows African American students to come over, I think some of those programs are they are doing well, and they may help to dispel some of these myths about the relationship. And because some of the things, and I'm not saying that we have a perfect relationship, but I also think that some of the things are just made up to divide us and are unnecessary. They are not grounded in any evidence at all. So then that's my short response for that.
Very good. So, next question or comment. Yes, sir. David.
Okay, sir. I don't know for how long this foreign exchange program has been with the Black Americans, let's say African Americans coming over here to come and learn. Because what I normally see on the internet is that the way the Blacks are treated there, that's the same way the Blacks that's the same way they think of us. Because even on the internet, when some of them come here to come and have a feel, they go and give all sort of racist comments that we are, what's the word? The word is not coming. Yeah. Like we are old people. No, archaic. The word is not coming. Yeah,
Can you say the word in Chi or I don't speak Ghana?
What? There's a word for it. But I say it's cinema. That's the word. Thank you, brother. So the word I was speaking was primitive. Right?
Primitive.
Yeah. We have primitive ways. Because J. Cole came to perform somewhere in Nigeria. J. Cole, a US rapper, came to perform in Nigeria and posted it online. And the Black Americans were like, oh, Africans, do they have iPhones? I was like, what? It's a new world. So I don't know why they're still thinking less of us. So sometimes when I see all those racist stars out there, I don't feel bad for them, honestly.
Okay.
Because that's how they see it. So that was just a comment I just putting out.
Yeah, I also see things like that online. But I think some people they just don't have the experience. I mean, they get so surprised when they get to Africa. This is Africa. Yeah, but Africa and the rest of the world, we have been having this relations for a very long time. It's not new. So I think some people just don't have. But there's also the issue about identity or belonging. Some people feel like maybe you are not part of them in the creating of their state. They suffered more than you. There are also all these ideas about you sold us into slavery. So there are undertones. There's some tension in there, and all these things about people being primitive and backward. I think it's sort of made up. I've also heard people in Ghana say that you go to some parts of the US and you wouldn't believe that you are in the US because of the level of poverty there. So I think we need to get to know each other more and then to interact more and to improve our relations.
Very good. Next question, comment. Don't be shy. Anyone want to engage Mr. Eweh? Okay, I'll ask a question. There's a hand. Great. Yes, sir.
So, I want to find out that, in your view, do you think that a lot is being done to help educate? Because people migrate, people go, and then they face all these challenges and all these crises and all that, and still people go. Do you think much awareness and education that is ongoing for people, because I know that there are people who are stubborn, obstinate, that even though they are told, they get to know about all that is going on around the world, they still go. But I do think that generally education, awareness is ongoing to the extent that it will help people to be well informed, so that if they are to embark on such journeys or ventures, they will think twice and then maybe decide to stay back into it.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. Whether people are aware of the risks and the genders and the dangers of migration.
Yes, whether
Yeah.
education.
Yeah. Yeah. So generally, what I'm trying to say is that my view is not that I'm opposed to migration, but that migration has certain drivers. So if your economy is not, it really tanks, or it goes really low, and some people, what comes to their mind is migration, and at that point, sometimes it becomes almost a psychological issue. They don't want to do any other thing than to migrate. So I think as young people, we need to do more to hold our governments responsible, because I don't think a lot of people will be interested in moving abroad if they think things are okay. If you know that you have a future, you finish school, you can get a job. I don't think you worry much about moving to another place, and especially using all these dangerous risks, going through Libya, being in the Sahara for 3 or 6 months for what? So I think young people, we have to start having meetings and to think about how we can hold our governments more accountable, because the decisions that they take affect our lives and the chances that we have for survival and our families and all. So I think that's also, I think that with respect to awareness creation, sometimes there are arrangements between the countries in Europe and African countries, which is sort of like an economic stimulus. You give money to the African countries with the idea that that money will be used to develop livelihoods for people, so that they don't travel or they don't try to find their way to Europe. Whether that thing really works or whatever that money is used for, I think that's also something to think about. Yeah. All right.
Very good, thank you.
Yes,
Follow up. Yes.
I agree with you saying that we need to keep our governments accountable. I mean, if jobs are available and all that, if we are comfortable, no one would really want to travel. But I think that in a way, it becomes like a sort of a luxury for some people. Now, how much is enough? Because I believe that there will be people that, even though personally, economically, they are not doing that bad. But this is something that has gone, and people have gone, and they feel that those who go there do well, will do better, no matter what you are doing here. I think it is something that subconsciously have got into people's minds. So even though if the government hasn't done as much as it needs to do to help the youth secure jobs and all that, I believe that helping the youth also get to know that, because you can do things also, you can do something like entrepreneurship and all that.
Yes.
You start from somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think that it is good, noting that it is noteworthy that the government is supposed to see to it that there are jobs available for the young ones and all that.
Yeah.
But then also to help the young ones deal with that impression that it is always better, because I believe that most people have it in mind that it's always better to go out there, because you will definitely make it than someone who is here.
Yeah.
You mean the system is working?
Yeah, I agree with what you are saying. Yeah, sometimes people also use migration as a means to accumulate. So when you migrate, you may earn more, even if you do a job. That doesn't give you some dignity. You may be able to earn more, accumulate, acquire some property here, and do something. Yeah, I think, and the thing about holding government accountable and the government working, the entrepreneurship thing you mentioned, it's true, it's really important, and there are government programs for that. But there are also other things which you cannot directly target or point to as the cause. For instance, when you talk to people, when we had our energy crisis, a lot of people lost their job because of that. I mean, if you operate, a small frozen food shop, if you're a barber, small things like that. So creating jobs does not always mean, have a scheme that will create jobs for 100,000 people, but also keep the basic things, in place, the energy issues. Sometimes what people need is just, the basic things that they need to be able to grow their businesses and things like that. So when those basic things are destroyed, then you have to find your way outside of the country, because even the basic things that you need to survive and to take care of your family are not there. So there's no hope. So we don't want to reduce our countries to a situation where young people do not see any hope at all.
Very good, thank you. There's a question here. Yes, sir.
The migration issue.
Yes.
Sometimes, okay, let me say something. But most often, the sabotage from the Western powers is very evident. And according to some research that I've seen, it's not, migration is not just something African. Even in the UK, rating the geographics of people that migrate to the UK, Africans were one of the lowest. And people from around this part of Asia, the Middle East, India, have higher percentages than Africans. And when you go to the Middle East, for example, you see what is ongoing in Palestine. People have to migrate. Imperialism is crazy. Someone always wants to be an oppressor because he feels that I need an empire to always sustain my country's influence. And that thing too has led to a lot of underdevelopment in many parts of the world. It's not even just in Africa. Me personally, I hold the view that USA is the most evil country I've ever seen in my life. Someone will ask me, but I can go in there.
Amen.
When you go to Congo is suffering because of the cost it has to pay for being the richest country in the world. Most of our foods, most of our lactose, most of our refrigerators, we will not be able to use it without Congo. But you always say Africa is poor, but you can't leave this away. Patrice Lumumba was murdered by the CIA in Belgium. If you go in depth, it's crazy. So you see, the history is so sometimes it's like they want, and I saw something they called a conspiracy theorist. This man, the former US Secretary, Blinken, there was this talk that they want people in Nigeria. They are afraid of Nigeria's population and Nigeria's potential. Even though Nigeria is considered a shithole by Trump, the biggest economies and the largest economies, they are 30, number 30 the whole world. Even though they are considered a shithole. So that means that their population helps them a lot. Their natural resources too. It helps them a lot. So there was this investigation someone did, and he noticed that Blinken and others planned that they need to keep suppressing a country like Nigeria to have their workforce come here so that they don't get to achieve their potential. But for now, it's just a conspiracy theory. That's what it says. So we can't give it much value. So you see, when you hear all of these things and things like that, the issue is not just like out of our own free will. We can't get to where we have to be. A lot of times there's a lot of sabotage. So it's like you can't reach your potential because apart from having useless African people, they are also fighting off imperialism on another hand.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great comment. So in relation to so as I noted, wars and conflict are also important drivers of migration. And then maybe at that point we have to start considering whether we should really call that migration if you are moving because of a war. So we also see high rates of migration in places like Afghanistan and Syria, and also countries that are under sanctions. Migration is also high in Cuba. Yeah, Cuba. We also have people who are trying to cross the sea and they also die. So Cuba is another case in point. But another thing about migration is that in the Western countries, they are highly selective when it comes to migration. For example, nurses, you know, for old folks' homes, they are very selective in the kinds of. Sometimes you have a whole generation in the UK. You have a whole generation of people who moved from the Caribbean to UK after the end of the Second World War to provide services. So at that point, it becomes convenient for them to accept, people. But at some point, the doors are also shut. So I think a lot of the things you said are really important. So Nigeria is always competing with South Africa on the African continent. Which one is, the largest economy?
Yeah, even though right now Nigeria is at its poorest state.
Yeah.
The president is a CIA operating.
Okay. But then we also need to talk about how do we share in all that money that Nigeria is getting. How come they are so rich? But another thing we have in Ghana is we have Nigerian migrants in Ghana.
Yeah.
Means that the people are getting tired of the place, of the leadership. So how come Nigeria is so rich, but also people are not happy with the situation there. So we also have to think about how they are sharing the wealth that that country is creating. So that's also another point.
Very good. Thank you very much. Another question, comment. Anyone? I see a lot of people thinking. Okay, so while you're thinking of your questions, I'll pose a question. Mr. Eweh. You spoke earlier you talked about literacy rates. Give us some of your insights on how do we improve the literacy rates in Africa, especially among the youth. Do you have any ideas that you have gleaned from your research on ways we can improve literacy among our young people?
Yeah. So that's also another debate about what language are you going to use as a basis for calculating literacy. But I guess for the contemporary period, English is the main mode of instruction and communication, especially in government agencies and in international business. So until the day that Africa comes to the decision that we are going to use Swahili or Dagumba, see this lady, she wants us to use Dagbani. Or so the day that we decide, at least the evaluation will be based on the language. And I think when we come with issues like literacy, it's important to consider the rural areas. Some years ago, we had a former president who had an initiative called removing schools under trees. I think that problem is still there. It still hasn't been solved. That children do not have well-constructed classrooms and facilities. We need to make the classroom a place of fun, and not for children to be sitting on stones and blocks. It doesn't make learning fun. So I think those are some of the things that we should not only focus on just free SHS. We should be doing things at all levels, from the primary school to the higher levels. And I think that another thing you can do to improve literacy, especially at the primary school level, is also to include school and nutrition programs. Some research has shown that increases attendance in schools, because they know they'll go to school and they'll not be hungry, there'll be food to eat. And also improving water and sanitation facilities for girls in rural and poor urban areas. The school also needs to be like a home, so that it doesn't feel like you're being punished for studying. Yeah.
Excellent response. Thank you very much, and insightful. Question? Yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you have observed some really interesting developments, especially in England, that country, England. where it looks as if for maybe as long as I've observed in the past 5 years, or slightly more or less, they have used people of color to lead their anti-migration policies. Yeah, people like, before there was Kemi Badenoch, there was Priti Patel, and then the other one who has a very long name, I don't remember. But, and it seems these people of color, I mean Rishi Sunak, these people of color who are also themselves migrants, whether they are first generation or second generation, they're also migrants. Yet they have been put at the center of anti-migrant policies. And they seem to be doing it with all the vigor and all the enthusiasm. And there's something very confusing about that. I was wondering if, within the course of your reflections on the migration crisis and especially social relations in migrant destinations, if you've observed these developments and if there are some deeper thoughts or insights that you have garnered from your work concerning this phenomenon.
So that's the difficult question that I can't answer. I really don't know how to make sense of those institutions, that are often headed by immigrants, and then they seem to even push restriction on immigration. But it's a conservative party, so another thing is how do these people even feel comfortable in the conservative party? So that's a really difficult one. I don't know. That one requires different levels of analysis, from the psychological micro analysis to to the macro level. How some people who are immigrants feel so comfortable with pursuing a policy that is anti migrants. Yeah, that's a difficult one for me. I need to do some more thinking on it. But they are not representing themselves. They are representing a base and a party which is basically not friendly to immigrants. Yeah. Because what they are doing, the policies that they are pursuing, they are consistent with the party's ideology and how they go about things. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions, comments, observations. Anyone like to have the floor? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I believe that the question that I want to ask, I believe that maybe somebody, when I start, someone could help to practice for me. But
Okay.
it has to do with all these international human rights organizations like Amnesty International. Do you think that their role, and I'm beginning to see trends of some nations who are beginning to defy, some of their, how do you call it? Their, how is it? International? Yes, like those codes in dealing with humans and all that. So that if those things, their codes are enforced, it helps to check some of this treatment that people like migrants receive out there. Do you think that those measures are becoming, those organizations are becoming sort of weak, and so then some of these nations that give inhumane treatment to some migrants are taking advantage of that and then operating that way? I don't know if my question is.
So then we are raising a question of international law. I mean, international law is interesting because some states are able to defy international law and they don't get punished for it. But I know that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees has really critical about the move by the UK and the Rwanda to resettle migrants in Rwanda. I know it's been very critical. Whether the UK will consider that and will change its policy, we don't really know. Some states, another thing is that there's international law, but there's also power within the world order. That some states are able to do what they want, and basically we can't really do anything about it. And whereas others are held to a higher standard. So that's also something that we have to be aware of. That some people are able to get away with things that are even criminal, but others can't do that. So another thing about international law is its enforcement, and because it's international law, the argument some would make is that if it's international law, it doesn't mean that it applies to my nation. So I have sovereignty in terms of the decisions we make in our nation, and international law does not apply to us. I know that in places like South Africa, international law is sort of automatically national law. Once there's an international law or there's a consensus in the international community about something and it becomes a convention, automatically it becomes national law. But this is not the same in all countries. The fact that you have international law does not mean that it applies to my national law. So that's also another issue.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 1, 2 questions at the most. Does anyone want to pose an inquiry? One of the questions I have, Mr. Eweh, is considering that, and correct me if I'm wrong, people in the room, 100% of this room, almost 100%, the large majority of the people, our students, people in this room want to leave Africa. So what practical advice would you give them in terms of, you're certainly giving them information that is valuable, but this is in light of conversations I've had to realize how unaware our youth are about the destinations that are most popular, particularly in the Western world, right?
Yeah.
Almost like no knowledge of what America is like except for through Hollywood. So what type of practical advice, because they are the cream de la cream and many of them are going to migrate. So what practical advice can you give them so that they are not, so that it's a positive experience for them and perhaps for development on the continent as opposed to them being victimized, or as one of our speakers said earlier in the week about the silence that's induced in people who have been taught not to have much self-esteem. He calls it intellectual rape, right? That was Professor DaCosta, I think. What's some practical advice that can be empowering to them as opposed to saying, instead of lamenting, what's some practical advice you can give them based on your knowledge of the realities of social relations in migrant destinations and this migration crisis that is a reality? Yeah.
Well,
Try and convince us.
not to go not okay. You know,
So we want to travel, see, and then
I think we've advised ourselves
okay. So the lady said she used a very interesting word, japa. So that's also a new lexicon, because 5 years ago, japa did not really mean, you wanted to travel. Maybe there were other terms, but
Japa, it's a Nigerian
pidgin
language.
Okay.
Japa, like Japa means vanish.
Vanish. Yeah, but I mean, in the last 5 years, maybe 5 years before now, that it was there.
I've been there for years.
So how come I've never? How come I'm not aware? It wasn't in Ghana.
It was probably limited to Nigeria.
Yeah, but then the word has
Recently,
been
it has
there.
become
Exactly.
Yeah. So
broken the borders of it.
yeah. So that in itself is interesting. That Japa has found its way into Ghana. Ghana's migration and lexicon shows that people really want to go. And personally, if I also like this thing about experiencing the world. So it's good to experience the world.
Okay.
you will learn. This guy head okay, and he's not going to listen to it. So it's good to experience the world. But if you are going to do it, please just make sure you do it through the regular means. And that is not going to be your home. So I understand that you want that experience.
There's no place like home. Even my aunt's house, I said,
Yes.
We'll come and build houses here.
These people's minds are already made up. Okay. So go and experience the world. But come back in a really short time. Don't take long. Go and I like this idea, but you want to experience the world. It's really good. Go and experience the world. Learn something new. But while you're also going, our presentation also showed that there are certain dangers out there. So when you go to, that there are certain risks out there, and you should be ready to deal with them. So be careful if you plan to go. That there are risks out there, and that you have to be careful. You are not going to be given a red carpet to walk on because you wanted to go. Yeah, you are. I mean, the work is going to be difficult, but if you want to experience it, I won't stop anyone from experiencing it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
You almost convinced us.
Really? I don't know if I gave the wrong answer. All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's give him a round of applause. Wonderful presentation. And again, Mr. Eweh, we are grateful for the impact that you've had through your presentation, and especially your willingness to engage us in a diverse range of questions. And you handled them beautifully. So we will certainly be inviting you to AUCB in the future. You're invited next week to our charter launch, starting on the 13th. We'll be having fun from the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th. Right? So I'll share that information with you because we'll have a lot of our alumni around as well as stakeholders.
All right.
So you're always welcome at AUCB.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. So in time to close it out.
Okay, so
Bring the mic down. Bring it down.
see, I know I'm vertically challenged. It's okay. So thank you very much for coming. I know it's not easy because as students you have to combine your studies, joining the seminar, to listen to long hours of lectures. But one thing that you can really take from this thing is that you grow because you meet different people. You are regular students. Sometimes you come here, you go home. These are some of the extra things that you can do to build up yourself. So thank you very much for being part of this program today. Next week, as we'll be having subsequent programs, we advise that you also come and be part of this program with us. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you.